Hophni were cursed of God, but they were still in the picture. Samuel's continued to follow God in spite of the bad example set by Eli and his wicked sons Phinehas and Hophni. And as we look at this morning's lesson, we'll see the fulfilled judgment on Eli's house with the tragic death of his two sons. But we'll also see the consequences of a nation not following God's will and leadership. Here recently we've had several lessons regarding the sins of individuals and the impacts that even one individual, Brother Rowland preached a message on the sins of Achan and how it didn't just impact Achan, but it impacted his whole family and the whole nation of Israel, because there were many others that lost their lives because of the sin of Achan. It is important that we recognize the sin in our life and work to eradicate it. Are we going to become sinless? I won't. I am in a sinful flesh. But we need to have that desire to eliminate the sin in our lives. Those things that we knowingly and repeatedly do in spite of God's word, we need to get them out of our life. Clean it up. Because it doesn't just affect it. Who does it affect most? Well, it may affect me, but it also affects most the ones that we love, because they're the closest to us. They see it and they're impacted by it. And so these are important lessons for us as we look at this. This is not just a lesson for lost people, but it's a lesson for God's people. Israel was the chosen nation of God. Now, many of them did not recognize, did not believe, would not follow Jehovah. But there were many that did. But even in the lives of saved individuals, in fact, maybe especially in the lives of saved individuals, we have to conduct our lives in a way that we're a witness to others and not turning them away from God. And too many times, we do things in our life that turn people away from God. As we look at chapter 4, that's where we're going to begin this morning, we're going to see that Israel is defeated by the Philistines. Up to this point, with what we've talked about in 1 Samuel, why do you think that Israel was defeated by the Philistines? Because they didn't follow God. That's right. And again, going back, we see one of the first evidences in Samuel of sin in the lives of individuals in Phinehas and Hophni, the sons of Eli. Priest in the worship, I would say at the tabernacle, but I'm not sure that the Ark of the Covenant was there in the tabernacle, but certainly in the sacrifice of the offerings. They stole from God, and they caused the people, the Scripture says, they caused the people to sin. And so 2 individuals in the nation were a big influence on the whole nation in turning away from. They corrupted the worship of God and the sacrifice, and they stole. In addition to that, their sins of lust and lying with women were also problems that stood out. So as we look at this, let's go ahead and read 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. Anybody? All right, so we begin in verse 1. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. Again, this was something that under the previous judges, it seemed that there was no judge over the entire nation, but they were more regional or by tribe. But here we see that Samuel, his influence was being seen, being felt across the whole nation. Says, now Israel went out against the Philistines to battle, pitched beside Ebenezer, and the Philistines pitched in Aphek. The Philistines, this is not the first mention of them. Where have we heard of them before? Yeah, a long way back. You go back to Genesis chapter 21 and 32. They were in the time of Abraham. In Exodus 13 and 17, they were mentioned in the Exodus, Moses and the Hebrew children from Egypt, when God told them to avoid the ways of the Philistines, even though it was a shorter route. He said, don't go through their land, go around. It may very well be because of their practices. Their origins, the Philistines, has been speculated that they came from the Mediterranean isle of Crete and migrated to the Mediterranean shores of Palestine there, Gaza Strip. You're familiar with that today, and that area. They are not listed among the nations defeated by Israel during the time of Joshua's battles, and it may very well be that they just simply were a very small people, not in stature, but in numbers and strength. And so they weren't mentioned during that time, but during the times of the judges, they became much more prominent and really stand out in the story of one judge in particular, and that would be Samson. Yeah, when you go back and you look at Samson, who was the nemesis? It was the Philistines, and they were very set to destroy Samson and the Israelites. They were consistently identified by 5 great fortress cities: Ekron, Gath, Ashkelon, Gaza, and Ashdod, along with a notable number of giants among them, one of whom we recognize the name as Goliath. Okay. So, in this battle that's mentioned here, the Philistines were invading, once again, Israel. They were launching from Aphek, which I believe was on the Palestinian side, west of Israel, but they were coming eastward into the nation. The Israelites were gathered there at Ebenezer, thank you. At Ebenezer. And there was probably about a 2 to 4 mile distance between them, depending on their exact locations. We see the results of this battle. Israel lost 4,000 men in the battle. And what was their response to it? In verse 2. Why did God do this? Actually, I guess it's verse 3. Yeah, why did God do this? Now, were they off in their assessment? Not a lot. God, a permissive God, oftentimes, and I think in this case we'll see, that God uses lost people in judgment of his people. Oftentimes. Egypt was used with Israel. We see Babylon was used with Israel. And the same is true for us today. Oftentimes, God uses lost people in his judgment of his people. And I think that they were very well on track. It might be his permissive will, but he also may have laid it on them. I don't know. Verse 3 says, and when the people were come into the camp, the elders of Israel said, wherefore hath the Lord smitten us today before the Philistines? So they come up with a solution. And the solution is what? Yeah, let's go to Shiloh, retrieve the ark, and let's bring it back here. Now, that's about 20 miles. Shiloh, retrieve the ark, and bring it back here. Yes. Now, where did they go to God and talk to God about it? Who were they talking to about this plan? Each other. There's no mention at all that they went to God in prayer. They identified that their loss in their own mind was because God had brought them or had smitten them. But from there, what would the correct solution have been? Should have gone to God. Ask him why. Why has this come upon us? But they didn't. They came up with their own plan. Verse 3, middle of verse, let us fetch the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of Shiloh unto us, that when it cometh among us, it may save us out of the hand of our enemies. Now here, and also down in verse 5, and when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth rang again. What are those two verses identifying as far as their attitude toward the ark? It became their idol. What was the real purpose of the ark? Remind them of what God had done. Those things that were placed inside were all reminders of God's providence for them. But it was not the power. God was the power. We lose track of those things oftentimes just like they do. Now, God makes promises to his people, doesn't he? Does he stick by those promises? Absolutely. And one of those promises is carried in Deuteronomy 3:22. Ye shall not fear them, for the Lord your God shall fight for you. What's that telling us? What was that telling them? To depend upon God. That God would deliver them in their battles. But obviously, here in this case, God didn't deliver them from their battles. Did God go back on his word? No. Later on, in Deuteronomy 28:15, there's some conditions that are added. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake thee. And it goes through a list of curses. In Deuteronomy 28:25 says, the Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be removed into all the kingdoms of the earth. Do we see that coming to pass in this morning's lesson? Absolutely. They chose not to follow God and his commandments. How many of us in our day-to-day life knowingly choose not to follow God, to do those things that are wrong, to not do those things that God would have us to do in our lives? There are times in my life when I don't do what I should, or I do those things that I should not. Does God bless us in those? What about the consequences for doing those and not doing? It's important. If we come out of nothing else out of this lesson, it's important that we understand that sin and not following the will of God is sin. Sin has consequences. And many times they're devastating, not only in this life, but also in the life to come. So there's no indication of any prayer or guidance. They didn't look to God. There was never a time when Israel fought a battle, when the Lord fought for them, that they lost. Why do so many of us fail to obey God's commands in our lives, and yet we still expect for God to bless us and to provide for us, for good things to come out? But it's kind of the nature of the flesh, isn't it? Many saved people are just the same in our attitudes. You know, we think, I'm a saved individual. I'm God's child. I can now do what I want. but it is not without consequence in our lives. And again, not just the consequence to me, but to my wife, to my children, to my grandchildren, to my church. The blessings can be impacted upon all of those. So they get the bright idea. We're going to go get the ark and it will save us. They treated it more like an idol. Or how many of you have a rabbit's foot? Or a lucky coin? Or a horseshoe, lucky horseshoe? Or go down the list. Luck. You know, we are not people of luck. We're people of providence when we look to God. That's a real big reason to not play the lottery, to not go to the casinos. The ark was a symbol of the presence and the power of God. It was not to be worshipped as an idol. It had no power of itself, although there were a lot of restrictions on how the ark was to be treated and dealt with. And we'll see a lot of those as we look at the lesson this morning. God gave strict instructions on the purpose and proper handling of the ark. It was violated when they began this effort out of their own minds. God's ways are higher than ours. The high priest was the only one who was allowed to see the ark. And when was that? There's two instances. He was able to go into the Holy of Holies once a year, Day of Atonement. Once a year, Day of Atonement. He alone, no one else, could see it. The only other time that the ark was visible to anyone was when it was to be transported. And even then, who was the only one who could look upon the ark? High priest, and only for covering the ark. And then once it was covered, then the family that was charged with moving it, they took over and they delivered it, but they did not look on the ark. It was covered. So only the high priest, and only those two instances. So just to set us up for what we see coming about. Oh, absolutely, don't touch it. Yes. Yes. We saw in other scriptures the effects of someone, not out of intention. It was shaking. They thought it was going to fall. Why would God take that kind of action against that kind of intent? God's law is God's law. That's right. It was a desecration of it. God's law is God's law. And I don't care what you think or what you say or what anybody else says, God's law, you can't change it. Our laws get changed. We see laws today that, boy, it astounds me. You know, they're changing all the time. Marriage is changed. I could easily get off track here. Man is uneven in his ways. What's the scripture say? He wavers to and fro. God does not. Yeah. That's right. It is never an excuse. Never an excuse. All right. So they sent to Shiloh, verse 4, that they might bring from thence the ark of the covenant, the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth between the cherubim. And who brought it for them? Hophni and Phinehas. Now, where do we know them from? They were bad priests. Bad priests. What an irony that of all the people in Israel who would go and retrieve the ark, it was these two, the wicked sons of Eli. They're the wrong family to carry it. That's right. They were of the lineage of Aaron, the high priest, but it was really the family of Kohath that were charged with carrying the ark and the sacred items from the tabernacle. So here they are, the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. You would look at this and you would say, what hypocrisy? And sure it was. They knew not God. Verse 5, and when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel shouted with a great shout so that the earth rang again. Why were they shouting? The ark is here. Now, they were going to take it into battle. Is that the first time that's ever happened? When else was it taken into battle? Joshua, city of Jericho. What's different about then and here? God told them to. They followed God's instructions. They did as they were supposed to do. That's the difference. And what was the result? The walls came down. And they marched over and they had a great victory. We're going to see that the opposite happens here. They were excited. We have the ark. This is the same ark that went around Jericho and the city fell. They shouted with a great shout so that the earth rang again. Verse 6, and when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, this is somewhere between 2 and 4 miles away. They heard the shout of the Israelites. They said, what meaneth the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews? And they understood, so in other words, someone gave them word, brought word that the ark of the Lord was come into the camp. Now, look at verse 7. And the Philistines were afraid. Why were they afraid? It was the ark of God, and they had even hundreds of years after, they had heard the stories of the power of the God of Israel. The deliverance from Egypt. They even reference those things. He says, verse 7, and the Philistines were afraid, for they said, God is come into the camp. And they said, woe unto us, for there hath not been such a thing heretofore. Woe unto us, who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues of the wilderness. So, they knew the stories. They knew what had happened previously. They were afraid. Now, did they worship this same God? Why not? They are announcing the power of the true God of heaven, the God of the Israelites. Oftentimes, people will acknowledge God, but they will not repent, and they will not believe. And you'll see through these verses that there were several opportunities where they had the opportunity to recognize the truth, to turn to the true God of Israel, and they could have repented and believed, but they chose not to. Why did they think that? The Philistines, just like most of the nations around about Israel, did not believe in a God. They believed in multiple gods. And that didn't mean just their gods. They believed in their gods and they worshiped their gods, but they also believed that these other nations had their own gods that delivered them. And so oftentimes the battles were won based on we're in the territory of their gods, and so their gods are stronger. We're in our own, and our God is stronger. With the God of heaven, the true God of heaven, is that the case? Well, you could say that because it's all His. And these other gods that are no gods are no gods. Truly. There is no delivering power. And again, we'll see that as we go on. But the Philistines were polytheistic. And so they didn't have a problem with having their gods, but also recognizing power, a god of another nation. And many other nations were the same way. They oftentimes attributed to God certain power, sometimes more, sometimes less than their own gods. Woe unto us, they said. Who shall deliver us out of the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods that smote the Egyptians with all the plagues in the wilderness. Be strong and quit yourselves like men, O ye Philistines, that ye be not servants unto the Hebrews as they have been to you. Quit yourselves like men and fight. What is he saying in verse 9? Or what are they saying in verse 9? This is that pregame talk. This is that halftime talk. You know, we're going up against God of Israel, the one that delivered the Israelites from the power of Egypt. But they don't say, let's tuck tail and go home. What do they say? You're going to have to be men. You're going to have to fight to the nth degree. Quit yourselves like men. Be men and fight. Now, verses 10 and 11. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. How bad could it get? Well, they were upset because at the beginning of the chapter, they went to battle, and they lost how many? 4,000. How many did they lose in this battle? 30,000. I think carrying the Ark of the Covenant into the battle worked well for them, didn't it? But not only that, they lost 30,000, every man fearing. So they went into battle with the idea that God was going to deliver. But God was not behind them at all in their sin and did not deliver. The Philistines, on the other hand, went into battle thinking they were going against the God of Israel. They were not going against the God of Israel. They were going against mere men. And men who had offended their God, the true God of heaven. And so the result was natural. There was a great slaughter. They lost 30,000 footmen. The Ark of the Covenant was taken. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were slain. Now, that's according to prophecy, right? Hophni and Phinehas? Yeah. Yeah, on two occasions. Once in chapter 2 by an unknown prophet, and then again in chapter 3 by Samuel. They would both die in one day. Well, what happened? They died in one day. Verse 12. In fact, let's read verse 12 through the end of the chapter, 22. Anybody? All right. So beginning in verse 12, we see that a man of Benjamin, out of the army, soldier, came to Shiloh the same day. This is 20 miles. So he ran 20 miles to Shiloh with his clothes rent and earth upon his head. What's that significant of? I'm sorry? Mourning. Yep, mourning. Verse 13, and when he came, lo, Eli sat upon a seat by the wayside watching. He was waiting to hear the news, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. What's that telling us? He knew it was wrong. He was concerned when they came and they got it. As the high priest, what could he have done? He could have stopped them. As the high priest and the father of his two sons, when they got off into their sinful ways, what could he have done? He could have stopped them. But in both cases, he took the same approach. He knew it was wrong. He was trembling because they had taken the ark out into battle, and he knew it wasn't according to the will of God. And when the man came into the city and told it, all the city cried out. And when Eli heard the noise of the crying, he said, what meaneth the noise of this tumult? And the man came in hastily and told Eli. Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were dim. His vision was about gone, that he could not see. Verse 16, and the man said unto Eli, I am he that came out of the army. I fled today out of the army. And he said, what is there done, my son? And the messenger gives the report. What does he tell him? Verse 17, 4 things. Israel fled before the Philistines. It's not a good start. Why? Clearly, they lacked the confidence that God would have given them had they been in a right situation with God. 30,000 men died in the battle. Eli's own 2 sons died as was prophesied. And then the last one. And if you look, and the ark of God is taken, the last part of verse 17. Verse 18, and it came to pass when he made mention of the ark of God, what happened? He fell backwards. Why didn't he fall backwards when he heard about the 2 sons? It was prophesied. He knew it was going to happen. And it was their just deserts, just like our sin brings about our just deserts. But the Ark of the Covenant, it was God's. Yeah. 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 And yet, when you look at it, Eli knew right and wrong, did he not? So when you talk about spiritual dimness for Eli, it wasn't not knowing the truth. It was not following after the truth. It wasn't following after God's will. He didn't do what he ought to do. And that's what brought shame on him. Had he addressed Phinehas and Hophni, they may or may not have changed their ways. They did not know God. Scriptures are clear about that. They did not know God. But he would have alleviated his responsibility. Now, that would have meant, because of the actions that were being taken, stealing from God, according to law, they would have had to been put to death as a consequence of their sin. It is a responsibility of parents answerable to God that they stand and they not just let their kids know this is the right thing to do, that's the wrong thing to do, but there are times when you may have to do something about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Who's to blame for that? We're not conducting ourselves as we should. We're not speaking out. We're not sharing the gospel. The power to change a man or woman, is really the power of the gospel. It requires inward change. I don't care how patriotic you are. I don't care how much you stand up for liberties and freedoms and other things. And don't get me wrong, I'm not putting those things down. But ultimately, what changes an individual is within. It's in the heart and not outside. We can march in parades, we can wave flags, but our true allegiance is to whom? It's to God. But is it? Are we really, truly aligned with God to do what He's called us to do in our lives? To share the gospel with those round about us. Instead, are we out there and we look just like others, and when they see us, and we may have mentioned, oh, I'm a member at Brookside Baptist Church, but they see our actions, they hear our mouth, and they say, they're no better than me, they do the same thing, maybe even worse. Difference is, they claim that it's wrong and they do it. I don't see anything wrong with it. You know. Well, anyway. See where we got here. Okay, Eli. Did we cover all of that? Anybody else have any thoughts or comments? Yes. Yeah, he was. Yeah. Verse 18, came to pass, when he made mention of the ark of God, that he fell from off his seat backward by the side of the gate. His neck brake, and he died, for he was an old man and heavy. He was overweight. How do you think he got overweight? He was likely indulging on the stolen sacrifices of Phinehas and Hophni, partaking in their sins. But his neck brake. He died. He was an old man. He was heavy. And he had judged Israel for 40 years. Verse 19, it didn't stop there. Misery continued. And the daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, was with child, near to be delivered. And when she heard the tidings that the ark of the covenant was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself in travail. You know, the anguish, the news of what had happened caused her to go into labor. Her pains came upon her about the same time of her death. The women that stood by her said unto her, fear not, for thou hast borne a son. Now, fear not, for thou hast borne a son, normally would be in Israel. To bear a child was great news. But they treasured the sons above because they get out in the field and work hard in the field. Whether right or wrong. What should have been a blessing, and in fact, when you look and compare the wife of Phinehas to Elkanah and his wife Hannah, how would you compare the situations? Hannah, when she delivered a son, whose name was? Samuel. Did I say Samuel? Hannah, when she delivered a son named Samuel, what was her reaction? She was so thankful to God, felt blessed by God that she gave him back to him. When we're given children, what should our attitude be? That we would give them back to children, to God. Boy, I'm having a real problem here. To God, for whatever purpose God has for them in their life. Now, we don't have priests today, so don't pray for a son to be a priest, but is there anything wrong with praying that your son might be a preacher of the gospel, a pastor of a New Testament church? Quite the opposite. Is there any higher calling on the face of this earth? There is not. There is not. And yet, too many church members sort of look down on it. They don't want their sons to become preachers and pastors. Why? Because our own hearts aren't right. This should have been a great occasion for the wife of Phinehas, but instead, it was a sad occasion. Verse 21 says, and she named the child Ichabod, saying, the glory is departed from Israel. The name actually means, where is the glory? All right, any other comments or thoughts on 4? All right, we got 4 minutes to do the last 2 chapters. All right, so as we get to chapter 5, we see that the Philistines have captured the Ark of the Covenant. They normally would have taken it back to, I think, Gaza. However, the temple at Gaza had been destroyed by somebody mentioned earlier. Who was that? Samson, yeah. And so they wound up taking the ark back to Ashdod instead, the temple there. The house of Dagon, this is his home turf, right? And they put the ark in there. Do you think that they put the ark in there to be superior to Dagon? No. They believed that they had won the battle because of the power of their god, Dagon, over the God of Israel. What they didn't realize was neither God was involved. The God of Israel, in the sense of delivering victory, defeat, because God was not on the side of Israel, but also Dagon was no God in the first place. And so, but they gave praise to Dagon. They set it up by Dagon. Verse 3, and when they of Ashdod arose early in the morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the earth before the ark of the Lord. And they took Dagon and set him up in his place again. What is crazy about that? Here we have this powerful God who delivered victory in battle, and what did we just have to do for him? He couldn't raise himself. Now, is that not the most ridiculous thing you ever heard? And yet, lost men will contrive many different things about God to avoid recognition of God as the true God. They had to set him up. Verse 4, and when they arose early on the morrow morning, behold, Dagon was fallen upon his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off upon the threshold. Only the stump of Dagon was left to him. And therefore, neither the priest of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. So, a couple things here. Second day, it's fallen. But not only is it fallen, but yes, the head and the hands. What's significant about the head and the hands? They were important in battle. You didn't win a battle without head and hands. So they were looked upon as strength. Well, what was the strength of Dagon before the true God of Israel? He had no strength at all. But, and that should have been a second sign to them. But verse 5 says, therefore neither the priest of Dagon nor any that come into Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod unto this day. Why didn't they tread on the threshold? It's where the head fell. And so they considered it sacred. This decapitated idol, this thing made of whatever, wood, stone, whatever it was. But that is lost meaning. Goes on, verse 6. The hand of the Lord was heavy upon them. That wasn't it. It was of Ashdod. And he destroyed them and smote them with emerods, even Ashdod and the coast thereof. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel shall not abide with us, for his hand is sore upon us and upon Dagon our God. They sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines unto them and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they answered, let the ark of God of Israel be carried about unto Gath. We'll send it to the other Philistine city. Let them deal with it. Now, what's this emerods? It's swelling, boils, sores, illness, something along that line. Josephus believed it was dysentery. However, most today, and especially when you look later on in chapter 6, I think it may be verse 15. Well, anyway, it's connected with mice and rodents, which would indicate possibly what? Bubonic plague. So it may very well have been that. We don't know exactly. We're not told. But they got these sores, boils, swellings. It caused many to die. Therefore, they sent it to Gath. Gath, in turn, suffered the same thing. So they sent it to Ekron. Ekron suffered the same thing. So what did they decide to do? Yeah, they got some expert advice. Who did they go to? Did they go to Israel to find somebody who knew what they needed to do? No. They went to their priest and diviners. What's a diviner? Soothsayer. Someone of the occult. Someone who looks to the stars. Someone, any of you look at your astrological signs? Won't do it. That's what they used, was those things. They tried to speak to the spirits of the dead, concoctions to come up with their prophecies. What shall we do? These priests and diviners came up with their solution. Put them on a new cart and hook it up with 2 milk cows. And that's according to the law of Moses, right? No. No. Not only that, but these were milk cows in nursing calves. They had never been hooked up to a cart, so had anybody trained them to pull a cart? No. What about the nursing aspect? What would a milk cow naturally do? They would go back to nurse. And so the whole concept was ludicrous, but that's what they chose. But in addition to that, they decided, and evidently they knew a little bit about Israelite sacrifice, because they decided to send a trespass offering. However, what did they send as a trespass offering? What does God say about that? The 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not make graven image. And yet they went on their own. They made these things and they sent it on its way. Now, believe it or not, they made their way to Beth Shemesh. Beth Shemesh. There we go. I was looking for the word so I could pronounce it. Beth Shemesh. Now, Beth Shemesh is the first city across the border into Israel. But what was unique about Beth Shemesh? I don't need my heart rate. I need the time. Oh, thank you. Okay, I'm over time. What about Beth Shemesh? So it was a city given unto the Levites to dwell. You remember that they didn't get an inheritance, but they received certain cities. Beth Shemesh was one of those. Guess what group was assigned to Beth Shemesh? The Kohathites. Now, who were the Kohathites? They were the ones that were given to carry the ark and the sacred things of the tabernacle. So, should they have known what was right and what was wrong, what did they do? Left it on the cart. They looked inside of it. They took the 2 milk cows and they made an offering unto God. Was it ever given that they would offer a female on the altar? No, a male. A male. They should have known better. What happened? Well, according to the scriptures, 50,070 died, were smitten of God. I'm sorry? Yep. They should have known better. God's people should have known better. Too many times today, we should know better than the things that we do. But we oftentimes, for our own convenience and pleasure, we don't follow God, and we pay consequence for it. But not only us, but those around us. Any other thoughts or comments? Thank you.